Good evening, gentlemen. We are holding in the middle of chapter 12, the final chapter of our discourse. And we save the best for last because we are explaining the nature of time as it relates to God. We said in the previous chapter that time is a created entity. Now we're getting into more detail. And in the last chapter, we spent a lot of time talking about the world of Adam Kadmon, right? Of Akudim, where everything exists all at once. Everything that was, is, and will be in the universe exists in one unity, which God then creates the world from. We are going to see, hopefully tonight, God willing, how that plays into this chapter. The question is, the question that we're holding on in this chapter is, we explained previously that the way that time is created is not all at once, but rather in a stepwise process. Because as we know, time is a creation, just like everything else in the world, that is created through the spheres. The spheres are essentially the means by which God creates differentiated existence. That everything is not one thing, but rather things have different natures, and things are there's multiplicity. The world is varied. It has many different types of things and many individual entities within it. And all of this occurs through the divine spheres, through the process of what's called light in vessel, the infinite interacting with the finite, the infinite expressing itself through the finite vessels. And we explained that really each one of the 7,000 years of human existence on earth, starting from Adam Arishon, starting from the first man, corresponds to 1,000 years, corresponds to a millennium. And each one of those millenniums, each 1,000 years, corresponds to one of the 7 spheres of Zah and Malchus. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Ched, Yesod, and Malchus. And within those millennia, within 1,000 years, every year has its own individual Rosh Hashanah. So just as each sphere of Atzilus contains within it the amount of time of 1,000 years, then that time is further subdivided in this process whereby we go further and further away from unity and more towards multiplicity. That time is divided into Rosh Hashanahs, which are then divided into Rosh Chodashim, into the heads of month, which are then divided into the individual days, and you have the hours of the days, and you have the moments within the hours. So and the moment is the smallest unit of time. The halachic moment is the smallest unit of time for which there is an individual godly life force. And each individual moment has, therefore, a specific divine life force. It has the life force of the moment, and it has the life force of the hour, and of the day, and of the month, and of the year, and of the millennium. And each one of those goes into creating that time. This is connected, by the way, this is just as an aside, which I don't think I mentioned yet, this is connected with the quote-unquote astrology that's found in the Gemara, right? That's found in the Jewish sources. We do believe that there is a legitimate notion of certain times having influence over certain aspects of a person or a person's personality, as is explained in the Gemara, right? It says someone that's born under Madim, which I believe is Mars, someone that's born under the red planet has a tendency towards violence, right? It says in the Gemara. So all these sorts of interesting things.
Abraham was Itztagnim, no? He knew how to read
Many people in Jewish history, etc. We say Pharaoh had people who read the stars and they could tell they predicted the future correctly. They predicted the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu. All these sorts of things. This has a root in Judaism, and what that is really rooted in is this idea that as the soul comes into the body, or as events transpire and they unfold through, so to speak, the lens or through the means of certain spheres, of certain divine energies which make up that time of year, that parcel of time, and that can influence what takes place then, because that's, so to speak, the means through which it is created, right? Every individual places have a different divine energy, individual people, right? There's nations, there's a concept of the 70 nations, each one of which has a malach, each one of which has an angel. There's all sorts of different lenses or processes through which the divine flow comes down into the world. So time is one of these. And the question that the Tzemach Tzedek asked, the holy Tzemach Tzedek asked, that we said last week, was, how can it be that all of this time exists all at once on, say, Rosh Hashanah? Right? On Rosh Hashanah, so to speak, the entire year is created. The energy for the entire year is drawn forth. And the question is how can the entire year, so to speak, exist at once? How does all of time, so to speak, fold into this one Rosh Hashanah? And then the higher question, what about 1,000 years for the individual Sfirot? You have all these different things. So what do we mean when we say that the whole year exists or is drawn forth, is created on Rosh Hashanah, which is just one day? What does that mean? What do we mean when we say that the whole year is in Rosh Hashanah? So we began to answer. We were going word by word because the answer is it's few words with a lot of meaning. We said, first of all, God himself is above time entirely, as we were explaining last week. By his very nature as God, he is above time and is not within time. And then we said as follows. We said, this is the third line on page 371. We said, V'heyes, sheresh hazman, being that the source of time, Umachmas tzimtzum vehispashtus, is because of the contraction and the extension, shahaya betchilas brias ha'elam, that it was at the beginning of the creation of the world. And last week we had not explained this idea yet. We were halfway through explaining it. What were we saying at the end of last week's class? We were talking about, we used an extended metaphor about a teacher teaching a student, right? Really the metaphor, the mashal as it's called in Hebrew, the parable, is a metaphor for every act of creation through divine expression. Everything that is created through the divine light, so to speak, is created in a 3-step process. And we said it's like a teacher teaching a student. A teacher teaches the student. What's the goal in teaching the student, right? We used the example of a math teacher. We said the teacher's goal is really to reproduce an instance of himself. The math teacher doesn't want to be the only person that knows math. He wants to create, there should be now a student, there should be someone else that knows math like I know math. That's the goal. The goal is he wants to create another instance of himself, so to speak. How does he do this? So there's 3 steps. First, he has to find the information to teach the student within his own mind and have that information ready to present to the student. Then he speaks the wisdom. The wisdom is outside of him, but the wisdom, this is during the process of teaching. It has not yet become part of the student. And the third step is that the student, at the student's level and in the student's place, assimilates that information, and the information becomes part of the student's mind. And we went into a lot of detail about the different steps of this process. Really, the reason why I brought up the metaphor in the first place is for what we said at the very end, which is that when the teaching is in the mind of the student, there is something that takes place called ratzoi v'shuv, which means, it's a Chassidic concept, which means approaching and retreating, rushing forward and moving back. What is ratzoi v'shuv? Ratzoi v'shuv is something that takes place anytime there is light in a vessel. Right, which is why last week we discussed the nature of lights and vessels. Right, as a reminder, what's the difference between a light and a vessel? Right, Chaim. Light and vessel are metaphors. Right, there's nobody the beginning student in yeshiva who thinks that it's desk lamps and pots up in Shemayim is vases. Yeah. Is missing the point. That's not the idea. We call them light and vessel. What are they really? Really, light and vessel are 2 modes of godly expression. There are 2 ways of God expressing himself. What's the difference between them? There's many differences between them, and it's a very nuanced relationship. Many, many thousands of words have been written about it. But one of the basic dichotomies between light and vessel is that light is a revealing expression of the source. Light is a revealing expression of the source. Light is like a person's reflection in a mirror. Very simple metaphor, right? The person's reflection shows you the person themselves, right? If there's something that's on the person, then it shows up in the reflection. If it's in the reflection, then it's on the person. The light reflects the person. The light expresses the person. What's the difference then between the light and the person themselves? Is the light can be where the person can't be. The person can't be inside a plane of glass. He can't be inside a steel plane. The light happens to be that it can be, right? So the light has the advantage that the light can go where the person can't go because it's an expression. It doesn't have that existence of its own, right? Which has many demands. A person themselves has to take up space, and he can't be where something else is, right? And he's of his own. He has his own sense of self where there's no room for anything else to be. Light is an expression. Expression is more malleable. There's more you can do with an expression. Expression, there's room for interpretation. There's room you can take the light and put it through a prism. You could take the light and capture it in a camera and then put a filter on it. There's all sorts of interesting things you can do with light that you can't do with a person.
Like Guf and Neshama, right?
The exact same thing. Light and vessel, body and soul. So the vessel, on the other hand, the vessel is the means by which the light can become a new person or a new thing in and of itself. So the vessel is not an expression. Is not an expression the way light is, I should say, pardon me. The vessel does not exist to express the source. The vessel exists to take the light of the source and make it into a new source somewhere else. Right? The whole notion of the vessel, in the metaphor, the vessel is the mind of the student. The mind of the student is the vessel. The teaching, the math that's taught is the light. Right? The light reflects the professor. Right? The mind of the student by itself doesn't reflect the professor at all. It's basically dead. It doesn't count for anything. It's not even a thing. Because it's not in the metaphor, it's not a person that can appreciate math. So it doesn't even really exist.
The light is the word in this parable. It's the words that the other.
That's what I'm saying. The teaching of the math. That's what I'm talking about.
You said it's the teacher. You said it's the teacher.
Pardon me. I didn't say. If I did, it was a mistake. The teaching of the math, the words that are said, is the light.
I may have heard.
So the mind of the student is the vessel. So the vessel on its own, right, doesn't work because the vessel on its own doesn't have the math information. It's not the teacher expressed in a different place. It's just something different. It's just different. It's just something else, right? Which is not useful because the whole goal is to create the teacher at a lower level or in a different place. The light, on the other hand, is also useless, just the math teaching, because the math teaching is ephemeral. As soon as the teacher stops speaking it, it disappears. And the thing is also that the teaching always points directly towards a teacher. It's only an expression. It's limited to being an expression. It's like saying the reflection in a mirror cannot survive unless the person is standing in front of the mirror. As soon as the person leaves, the teaching leaves as well. So really, what is the expression in the mirror? What is the reflection? It's really only something that's thrown off by the person himself. It doesn't have its own independent, it's always connected to the source. It doesn't have its own independent reality. It can't become a thing for itself. It's always only a messenger, right? It's like
the ray of the sun, right?
Like the ray of the sun, which is also light's the metaphor. The Rabbi Menachem Mendel, who you may have heard of, sometimes talks about how when shluchim go from the Rebbe, we used the shluchim metaphor last week as well. Good evening. Where we were talking about how the shluchim going from the Rebbe is also like an expression of light and vessel as a whole thing. So he sometimes talks about how when the shliach teaches the teaching of the Rebbe, it's not a good sign if the shliach, or if the student of any teacher really, is always saying, my teacher said this, my teacher said that, my teacher said this, my teacher said that. If you really became one with the teaching, if you really accepted the teaching and really believe in it, then it's not something just that the teacher says, it's something you believe as well. So why not just say it? Why do you always have to say the teacher says, the teacher says? If the student is always saying, my teacher said this, my teacher said that, and he never says the teachings for himself, really what that indicates is that it's really just the teacher here. There is no independent student. It's really just the teacher speaking with different lips. There's no independent being here of himself who's taken the teacher's teaching and assimilated it into his own mind and made it his own. right? So there is no teacher and student. Really, there's just a teacher with a different mouthpiece. Instead of his mouth speaking it, a different mouth is speaking it. It's like an extension. It's like a tape recorder. What's the purpose, right? A real student wouldn't always say, my teacher says, my teacher says. A real student absorbs and is able to say, he says it because he believes it. It's his. It's not his. He believes it. He knows it. It's not his teacher's. It's his. That's an aside. So it's the same idea here. That light is like the tape. Light is like the student that always says, my teacher says this, my teacher says that, right? It's not a thing for itself. It's just an expression. By its very nature, it's just an expression. It's ephemeral. So, the vessel on its own is nothing. The light on its own is nothing in terms of creating a new being like the teacher, a new person who knows math. Really, you need light and vessel. You need the teaching, and you need the student to absorb it. And if you have both, if you have the teaching and the student to absorb it, you have now a new being. And really, this is the process by which everything is created. A similar thing takes place. Soul and body is another level at which there is light and a vessel, right? A soul and a body. It's the same idea. The soul, as a pure expression of God, right? The soul is a spiritual being. The soul expresses God directly. The thing is that the soul always says, I come from God, I come from God. The soul, as its own expression, very roughly, generally speaking, there's many, many levels and gradations and whatever, but very roughly speaking, the soul on its own always says, this is God, this is God, this is God. The body on its own is a corpse, is a cadaver. How do you create a human being, which is really the ultimate separate entity from God? That you have God and then He creates another God in a human being, in a way, as explained in Chassidus at great length. He creates another independent being, another being that truly feels that they do not have a creator, that they are truly independent, which is only by physical things in this world. So there's two aspects. You have to have the soul, to make the thing even alive, to make the thing have any connection to godliness or to expressing godliness in that way at all. The truth is, that'll be too confusing. I'm not going to. So it would be the soul on its own is only an expression. So you put soul and body together, that is when you have a complete human being.
So what happens in the world to come when the soul is supposedly learning Torah? How can that happen without a body?
It's a spiritual experience. It's not an experience of separateness. It's an experience of unity. The question is, what makes the soul an independent existence there at all? Something very, very, very subtle. That's very hard to appreciate. The truth is that in the spiritual realms, what makes something an independent being is a much more abstract and difficult to understand thing than it is to understand that the table is different than the cup. It's not so simple. We have the fact that we are given time and space to separate things out and to say that the table and the cup cannot occupy the same space is cannot occupy the same space at the same time is actually a great convenience, because it's much less confusing for us. It makes things very simple, right? I know that the two things aren't the same. They're in separate space. They're in separate time. Simple, relatively. When there's no space and no time, at least not in the way we understand them, things become a lot more complicated. So that's the metaphor. You have light and you have vessel. Now, what's Ratzei V'shuv? What is approaching and receding? Rushing forward and moving back. Light in any vessel, it's really talking about every creation. Light is not comfortable being in a vessel. Light, in a sense, it has a dual nature. It has a split personality. Light does not stably exist within a vessel. The metaphor we gave last week was the metaphor of the shliach for Ratzei V'shuv, right? Yeah. That the Rebbe sends a shliach to Tuscaloosa. And the Rebbe's shliach in Tuscaloosa is there to spread the light of the Rebbe. He's the light in the vessel. Tuscaloosa is the vessel. The shliach is the light. And he's there to recreate basically the teachings of Chassidus, the teachings of the Torah and mitzvahs in a new place. He's there to recreate the original. It's the same process of teaching, of recreation, of creating in a different place. But he has a split personality. He has a dual nature when he's there. What's the dual nature? The dual nature is that when he is in Tuscaloosa, he doesn't want to be in Tuscaloosa. When he's in Tuscaloosa, all he wants to do is go back to the Rebbe and be receiving light from his teacher. Because the truth is that when you're receiving from your teacher, you're much more alive and you're much more true to who you are than when you're teaching. When you're teaching, you have to descend away. You have to descend to lower levels from what you truly are. When you're receiving, you're able to ascend to your greatest heights because you have to raise yourself up to the level of your teacher to receive. The shliach doesn't want to be in Tuscaloosa. The shliach wants to be learning from the Rebbe. So the shliach once in a while goes back to the Rebbe. And when he goes back to the Rebbe for Tishrei, say he goes back to the Rebbe for a month, the beginning of the year, all the Rebbe talks about when he's by the Rebbe is how important it is that the shliach doesn't stay by the Rebbe and the shliach goes to Tuscaloosa. All he talks about is how important it is that there's Jews in Tuscaloosa who don't know about Torah and mitzvahs, and you have to go and spread Torah and mitzvahs and bring them closer to Judaism in that faraway place. So the shliach goes back to Tuscaloosa. But as soon as he arrives in Tuscaloosa, he wants to be back by the Rebbe. This process, metaphorically, is what you call rotzei v'shuv. The light, as we said before, its very nature, by definition, is an expression. Light wishes to express its source. That's its nature. When the light is in the vessel, which essentially means, or when the soul is in the body, or when the teaching is in the student, the light has to essentially adapt to the needs of the vessel, which is really the entire process of creation, is in the adaptation of the light to the vessel. It becomes no longer an expression of God, it becomes a new thing, right? When God creates the world, essentially it's an expression of God that becomes the world. And what's the becoming of the world? Becoming the world, in Chassidic terms, essentially, is that it ceases to be purely light, because light cannot be a world. Light cannot be separate. Light always reflects its source. It ceases to be light, and it acclimates to the vessel. It acclimates to the needs of the vessel. Instead of expressing things in godly terms, it expresses things in terms of the thing that it is creating. And that's essentially what constitutes the soul of anything. That's essentially what constitutes the soul of each and every individual creation, is the light becoming not purely a godly expression, but becoming something defined in terms of the vessel, in terms of the thing that it is creating. So in the metaphor of the teacher and the student, right, you have light, which is the teaching of the teacher. But the thing is that the teacher, when he teaches in a certain way with certain words, and he teaches it from his perspective, which is a much more learned perspective than the student, right? And the student receives this light. Now, the student, when he receives this light, he can't just... In order for the light and the student to become one, the light has to leave its nature as purely an expression of the teacher, and it has to become part of the student. That's what it is in the metaphor. It has to become part of the student. But the light, by its very nature, is not really open to this process. This process is against the nature of the light. The nature of the light is to express the source. Right? Or in other words, it can be very difficult for the student to take the teachings of the teacher and adapt them into his own mind. The teachings of the teacher, by their very nature, right, are his words, his expression, the way he would put it, which the student will put it differently. And it's very difficult to bridge this gap, to make the teachings of the teacher into my own mind. Very difficult. So the light has a dual nature. It goes through a process. What's the process? The process is rotzei v'shuv. The light is in the vessel. The teaching is in the student. The light, like a candle, flickers up and down, is how it's described in Tanya. The light is a ratzai. It approaches meaning it approaches its source. The light is removed from the vessel, right? This is the student. The student contemplates the words of the teacher exactly as the teacher put it, right? To get more meaning out of it, right? He doesn't want to know what he thinks about it. He wants to know the teaching that he received. However, the entire point of the teaching that the student received was in order to teach the student. So the more he understands the teaching as the teacher originally gave it over, the more he wants to then adapt it down into his own understanding, which is the shuv. Shuv is returning into the vessel. But once he adapts it down to his own understanding, he realizes that there's something missing here. The teaching is not what I was originally taught. It seemed so clear when the teacher said it, but now when I'm reviewing it, it doesn't have the same light. It's not so clear. When he said it, it was clear as crystal. Now when I'm reviewing, it doesn't make sense to me. So he goes back and then he looks at it again exactly how the teacher said it. And once he sees exactly how the teacher said it, he sees how to adapt it to his own mind. Now imagine that the teaching cannot be exhausted. The teaching cannot be, this process is endless. There's no end to this process. There's always more and more to take out of the teaching. This is the process of ratzoi v'shuv. The light is ratzoi, it approaches its source, it ascends out of its adaptation to the vessel, and then, once it is out of its adaptation to the vessel, its true nature is revealed, what is its true nature? Its true nature is to be one with the vessel, and so it's brought back down into the vessel. But once it's within the vessel, it's not comfortable in the vessel because there's more to it than there is in the vessel, so it's ratzoi back up, like the flickering of a candle, up and down. This is called ratzoi v'shuv. Ratzoi v'shuv is the spiritual pulse, so to speak, of everything that exists. This is a dynamic. Good evening. How are you? Oh, thank you. This is a dynamic. Oh, thank you very much. Wow, that's quite a gift.
Didn't know that was being partaken.
Are you sure this isn't for the barbecue? This is for the barbecue steak?
Barbecue is downstairs. Yeah. No. No, leave it, please.
Making like the Heisman is fine. Sorry.
No problem. So this dynamic of ratzoi v'shuv, of the light approaching its source and then retreating back into the vessel, is the spiritual pulse of everything that exists, according to Chassidus. Everything that God creates has this dual nature to it. It has a soul which is always returning to its source to be redefined in terms of its source. And then, once it is redefined in terms of its source, it realizes that its true nature is to descend into the being. Now, the light never really leaves the vessel, right? When you're talking about a human being, God forbid to say such a thing about the human soul, right? The soul doesn't leave. The soul has a pulse. It's up and down. There's a certain wave motion to it. It doesn't leave the body, God forbid. Leaving the body permanently is death. Right? In fact, the process called Klis HaNefesh, which we talk about like Nadav and Avihu in the Torah, the sons of Aaron, who they were very inspired and they went into the Mishkan and their souls were taken from them with fire. Fire went into their nostrils and their spirits departed. Really, what that means in terms of what we're talking about is a ratzoi with no shuv. Their ratzoi became so powerful, they're approaching towards their source. The soul was so desirous of unity with God that it refused to be defined in terms of the body again, and it simply left, and it didn't return. And this was actually a negative thing. This was viewed on negatively by God. If you read the story in the Chumash, because the whole purpose is that there should be both. There should be ratzoi and shuv. There's a balance, right? The whole purpose is a human being is supposed to be alive in this world. They're supposed to be a shuv, but they're not supposed to be of the world. They're supposed to have a connection above, which is a ratzoi. And this dynamic is, so to speak, it's the human condition that there's this back and forth. Ratzoi v'shuv, which means approaching and receding.
But this dynamic usually stops at some point.
When you die.
Yes.
One dies.
Absolutely.
Theoretically, if you look at it and you take the human body or the human as an example, the world at some point will stop to exist as well.
There are. It says in the seventh millennium of the 7,000 years. It says Chod Choruv. One of the millennium will be a millennium of destruction, whatever that means. There's such an idea as well. The world is created for a limited amount of time. The question is, what does it mean when we say the one of destruction? What does that mean exactly? And really, the Kabbalistic and the Chassidic teachings explain that it's the destruction of the world as the world. The world, just like when the person passes away. When the person passes away, they don't cease to exist. What it is the soul ceases to interact through the world with a vessel, right? It's a ratzah without a shuv. They ascend and then they don't descend again to be within the world. So the same thing of the whole will take place with the entire world, that the entire world will cease to be worldly. The entire world will become godly in the
There's an opinion that God
times
is
of
creating
Mashiach.
and destroying, right?
That was actually mentioned in the previous chapter about the creating the world and destroying the world. That's actually part of what we're discussing here. So that is really only all an introduction to what I want to speak about in this class. So we have 20 minutes, right? Now that's Ratzoi V'Shuv. Chaim.
That was a preface.
That's like 101. Now we do 201. There is a very difficult to understand concept, which is a partner or a mirror image of Ratzoi V'Shuv, called Mati V'lo Mati. Mati V'lo Mati, which means to reach and not reach. Right? Similar idea. Extension and lack of extension. Mati V'lo Mati. That's what it's called. Sorry?
It's just for the ratzah.
1 second.
Mati Lakot, what was the standard one?
Mem Tet Yud.
Mati V'lo Mati. Where's time for what is so called?
I'm not sure. It's in Sifrei Kabbalah. I know that for a fact. I'm not sure where. I'm not sure where exactly the words come from themselves. That's a good question. This is not a common concept, at least not in Chabad Chassidic. It's mentioned in Sifrei Kabbalah, and it's explained in Chassidic. Yeah, not explained in.
Rashab talks about it a lot.
It talks about it a lot in one place.
Okay.
In the 30 books. The thing about the Rebbe Rashab is everything he talks about a lot, right? That's the thing. So there's no topic that the Rebbe Rashab talks about that he doesn't talk about for 20 pages, so
And I understand very little.
it feels like a lot. So, like this. Think back to the beginning of this metaphor that I was presenting. I said there's 3 steps, right? There's the teacher, as he has the idea in his own mind. There's the teaching, as he teaches it outward. And then there's as it is within the student. Ratzei V'Shuv is a dynamic that takes place within the student. Right? This whole Ratzei V'Shuv dynamic that we're describing about how the light ascends and then descends, away from the vessel and then toward the vessel, that all takes place within the vessel, basically, within the 3rd step. In the creation of the worlds, very generally, there's also a 3-step process for which this is a metaphor. The thing, as it is already created, light in vessel, is the 3rd step, at which there can be Ratzei V'Shuv. There is a second intermediate step, where the light is not in a vessel, but it's not in its source. And the first step is when the light is originally in its source. Now, let me draw some connections here for you. The light, when it's still within its source, is essentially a description of the world of Akudim, or Adam Kadmon, as we've been describing it, right? You'll recall, there's the 4 worlds as we normally talk about them. Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. These are, so to speak, the regular worlds that are discussed in Kabbalah. These are all worlds that are defined by Sphirus, which is another way of saying these are worlds that are defined by light in vessel. That's how these 4 worlds are defined. There's 4 different ways of light to be in a vessel. They're right in descending order, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. But the bottom line is that these 4 worlds are worlds that exist light in vessel. In other words, they are everything that we've been describing. All the creations that we've been describing. We say every creation has a body and soul. Every creation has a light in a vessel. We are describing in the 4 worlds. That's what makes them the 4 worlds, really, is that each one is created with different 10 spheres. Each one is created with 10 different lights in vessels. Now, We had a question in the previous chapter, but where do the vessels of Atzilus come from? We know the light is an expression of God in his infinitude. Light is simply an expression of God. But the question is, light is one, so it's not so strange that it should be there. There's one God, and there's one pure infinite expression. The question is how do we arrive at the world of Atzilus with 10 vessels? There's 10 different vessels. Where do the 10 different vessels come from? Right? What's the explanation? The explanation for where most different things come from variances within the world, is they all come from the spheres. They come from the different vessels, right? Like we say, the sweetness in the apple comes from chesed. The bitterness in the apple comes from gvura, to use a very simple example, right? The differences within the natures of things are based on the different combinations of the different spheres. But where do the differences in the 10 spheres themselves come from? There's 10 different vessels. Where do the vessels come from? So we explained that this itself is also a process. There's a process of the creation of the vessels, which is really a three-step process. Right? There is the light as it is within the vessel, which is the world of Atzilus. There's an intermediate stage in which the light is not in the vessel, but is outside of its source. And then there is a first stage where the light is still within its source. Just as there's three steps to the process of the creation of the vessels. There's Akudim, which is the highest world, where everything is united as one. There's Nekudim, Elam Atayu, where you have spheres, but the spheres are not inter-included yet. They're not properly in an ordered way yet. It's not light and vessel. It's basically just light. And then you have the world of Tikkun, of Vrudim, which is the world of Atzilus. So again, let's go through it again with our different metaphors. So, again, there is a three-step process to the creation of the vessels themselves. Where do the original divisions come from? Where does it come from that there's different things that are other than God, that, so to speak, have the ability to translate his light into a defined way of being, which is essentially what a vessel is? Where do these vessels come from? There's a three-step process. It's like the three-step process of the student teaching the teacher. You have the light as it is one within its source. You have the light as it's outside of its source, but not yet within the vessel. And you have the light as it's within the vessel. You have, again, the three steps. You have Akudim. You have the world of where everything is united and all of the spheres are one in one godly expression. You have Nekudim, which is Elam Atayu, a world where there basically are no vessels. There are vessels, but they're totally concealed. It's just light. That's the second step. And then you have the third step, which is the world of Vrudim, which is the world of Tikkun, the world where the light is fully within the vessels, and light and vessels become one. This is the process. So this metaphor that I've been describing to you is really, when I said it's a metaphor for the description of everything, of the creation of everything, that includes the creation of the vessels. The creation of the vessels themselves is a three-step process. The creation of the world of Atzilus, of light within vessels, is a three-step process. The process is, again, light within the source, light neither within the source nor within the vessel, light within the vessel. Rotzoi v'shuv, the idea that the light is not comfortable within the vessel, and so it is always returning towards its source and then descending back into the vessel, is when the light is within a vessel already. That describes how the light is within the vessels of Atzilus, within the world of Atzilus, within the world where light and vessels are one. The last step of this three-step process. The first step of this three-step process, when the teacher has the idea for the teaching in his mind, but it hasn't left the teacher yet, is the world of Akudim, is this vital world that we spent the whole last chapter talking about, is this first step, the first step of God's creation of the universe, in which everything is expressed all at once, all the world, spiritual and physical, past, present, and future, and everything in them are in one united expression. This one united expression is sometimes referred to as the machshava hakaduma da'ak, the primordial thought of Adam Kadmon. Because really what it is God conceives of everything that he will create in one unity, as we were explaining in the previous chapter, right? Before God creates any individual thing, before he even differentiates the 10 vessels, the 10 spheres, one from the other, the 10 spheres are united in the world of Akudim in one expression. Not as 10 things coming together, but there's really only one expression, and the one expression contains within it, in some sort of implicit way, the spheres that will come after. Now, this original thought for all of the creation that God has first of all is the source for everything that follows after, obviously, because it's God's thought that he will create everything. It's also referred to as one of the levels of Ratzein Hashem, of the will of God. Because this is the will that God has to create. This is essentially his desire for everything that comes after, for the universe, starting from this 10 spheres and going down through all of the spiritual worlds and the physical world. This is his desire. Now, so you have it's called the original thought of Ak. It's called of Adam Kadmon, of the primordial man, this level. You have, it's called God's will or God's desire. It's called the world of Akudim, the world of where all the spheres are bound together. And it corresponds in the metaphor to the teacher when he still has the teaching within his own mind. Now the thing is like this: there's something called mati v'lo mati. This is a very difficult concept to understand. Just as when the light is in the vessel and the teaching is within the student, there's a dynamic. There is a dynamic of the light leaving the vessel and then coming back down to fully dwell within the vessel, to be within the vessel. There is a corresponding mirror image process within God's desire to create the world at all. Within God's desire to create the entire universe, everything in it, all the spiritual worlds, past, present, and future, there is something called mati v'lo mati, extension and not extension. There is a desire, mati, there's a desire, and there's lo mati, there is a lack of desire. Essentially what this means what is a desire? What is a will? What does it mean when someone wills something? It explains in Chassidus that a will, even a human will, there's many different levels of will, different types, it can get very complicated, but one simple understanding of the will is that the will, when someone wants something, it's not really a individual faculty of the soul. It's not like a person thinks or a person feels or a person moves their hand or anything like that. That's one specific action of the soul. Because each one of those things will underlies them, right? In other words, each one of those things is something that you will. I have a will to think something. I have a will to speak. I have a will to feel a certain way, maybe. I have a will to move my hand, right? Will, desire of my soul is not any one thing. It's the thing underlying all the things that my soul does. Right? My soul is connected to my thought or my speech or my action or anything else that I do through my will. I desire to do it and then I do it. So the will is clearly not an individual expression of the soul, but rather a general action of the soul that underlies all of those things. The question is, what's the nature of this general action of the soul? The way it's explained in Chassidus is what's called a hatayas hanefesh. The soul turns. The soul is directed. I don't know what that means.
Inclined.
The soul is inclined, if it helps. I don't know if it helps. The soul is inclined. The soul turns. The soul faces toward a certain thing, right? I desire it means that my soul moves in place, whatever, moves toward that certain thing. Right? My soul is drawn towards this thing and not to this other thing. That's essentially what the will is. How can a soul be drawn to something? I don't know. What does it mean that the soul is inclined or turns or faces? I don't know. The point is that this is the description, right? The emphasis is, when we say that the soul turns, the emphasis is that this is not an additional faculty to the soul. In other words, it's not that you have a soul and then that soul can do A, B, and C. The soul can think, or the soul can feel, or the soul can move a body physically, the soul can speak, right? It's not that the soul does a specific thing. This is the one power that, so to speak, inherent to the soul. In other words, it's not the soul, and then there's a different action that it's a specific way of expression. This is the general expression of the soul. It's what's called a keach klali. It's a general.
It's like a character of the soul.
I don't know. Character is very nebulous. Character can mean lots of different things. Character, it's not clear. It's ambiguous. It's not a specific action that the soul does. It's the soul's inherent means of expressing itself. It's a general expression of the soul, not a specific one. That's the distinction drawn in Chassidus. Okay. Now the same thing. Where does the human will come from? It's a derivative of God's will. And God's will is seemingly the same thing, right? There's something called hatayas ha'atzmus. God himself, so to speak, faces in a certain direction or is inclined in a direction. That's what it means to want something. It's not an addition to him, in other words, if you understand what I'm saying. We're not saying that the Ratzon is like a separate creation or separate specific expression. Rather, it is he himself desires. Okay? So the desire for the worlds, in the world of Akudim, in the world of Ak, where God desires all the worlds, spiritual and physical, past, present, and future, and everything within them, this desire is a desire of God himself. Now, here's the thing. This desire, the desire as I've just described it to you, or will, is not an additional thing to the essence. It's the essence's way of being. It's not in addition. It's something that the essence does without needing any external faculty or lower way of expressing itself, right? It itself does this. We're already talking about something that I don't fully understand, right? That gets even weirder, because then we have something called mati v'lo mati. The soul has this turning. This turning has a dynamic to it, just like Ratzei v'shuv, a mirror image of Ratzei v'shuv. There is the direction, the inclination of the soul of God. Pardon me. There is the inclination of God toward creating the universe and everything that's within it, but that inclination is inherently unstable. Just like the light within the vessel, the true nature of the light is to return to its source, and the light wants to, so to speak, wants to return to its source, is how it's put, right? It's not comfortable within the vessel, and so therefore there's this dynamic of ascending and descending, of returning toward, of pushing towards the source and then coming back into the vessel. God, this turning of God's will itself, which is, again, it's not really a thing. In other words, it's not really a separate thing from God at all. It's the teaching as it's within the mind of the teacher. It's not a separate thing from the teacher. It's within the teacher. Right? In other words, it's not a separate thing from God himself. But this turning, or this inclination of the soul, is also inherently unstable, because its inherent nature, the inherent nature of God himself, is not to be directed towards an other, but is to be totally self-contained and contained within himself. Therefore, there is again an inherent instability. There's something called mati v'lo mati. There, so to speak, there is a very, very, very subtle dualism. Two things, two states. Mati v'lo mati. He desires to create everything, and that desire wishes to not be, wishes to be lo mati. It wishes to not the wishes to just be a state of to return to not desiring.
You're describing vacillation.
Yeah, in a sense, sure. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, it's not a vacillation that takes place in time, though. It's really, so it's weird.
Right, it's beyond space.
Yeah,
beyond space
right.
And beyond time.
And yes, and beyond being even a specific expression of God, which is very difficult to understand. So here's the thing. So when you read the long description of the Rebbe Rashab, you realize how strange it is, because the mati, the desire that he has, is not really a thing separate from him at all, right? And yet, it's so powerfully contradictory to his nature that what arouses from it is a lo mati. The desire is unstable, and the wish by nature tends to cease existing.
Antidote.
Ceases to be its opposite, to be annihilated, and just God remains. It's a very, very, very abstract concept. However, this abstract concept that we are now talking about, with 5 minutes left to the class, mati velo mati, is a few different things. First of all, mati velo mati is the source of time. There's really three things with time. There's time itself, there's the source of time, and then there's God who's completely beyond time. Time itself we sort of understand, more or less. I mean, we understand it's a creation at least. God himself we sort of understand, because we know at least that he's totally beyond time in every way. The source of time, where does time come from? It comes from mati velo mati, as we're going to explain in the Maimer. Mati velo mati also, it may interest you, is essentially, more or less, the source of all light and vessels. In other words, mati velo mati is ground zero for the dualism of creation. The very fact that there's a differentiation between light and vessel, or between soul and body, or that there's even room for two different notions, one of soul and one of body, derives all of it from this difference between mati and lo mati, between this desire and lack of desire, this turning of the essence, this inclination of the essence and lack of inclination of the essence. These two things, this is such a subtle dualism that is really this extremely subtle dynamic is really the source of all dynamism that there is in all of the universe.
You're also describing doubt.
In a sense, yeah, sure. That's one way of looking at it. Doubt is one way of looking at it. Because God desires and doesn't desire. Yeah, that's what you could phrase it that way. So the thing is that desiring and non-desiring, those two...
That bodes well.
We're here for the moment. We seem to think things seem to be fairly persistent, at least.
It seems to be fairly stable.
Well, I'll put it to you this way: if God decides He's not creating any of it, we won't be around to worry about it. So it doesn't really matter. It's not something to really be concerned about. So this extremely abstract dynamic is really the root of all light and vessel dynamics and everything that follows afterwards. So there's a different way of putting it, which is that, in fact, why don't we, I think he puts it well here in the footnote. Let's read the footnote. So let me read 2 lines in the Maimer, and then we'll read the footnote on page 371. As we explained before in chapter 6, this pattern of the contraction and expansion of God's light that took place at the beginning of creation is called mati velo mati. Let's read Rabbi Tzvi footnote. It's a good footnote. This term literally means it reaches, but it does not reach. That's how he translates it. It refers to the process in which the kalim, the vessels, are brought into existence from the light. Right? As I said before, this is the beginning of the process of the creation of the vessels. As the light extends, it reaches mati, the reshimu, which is the source from which the vessels come into existence. We've spoken about the reshimu in this class before, although not very extensively, I believe. That essentially the Rishimu is the source of vessels. The Rishimu is what we've called before, translated before, as the remnant, or the leftover of God's light when it is contracted in the Tzimtzum. Right? The first, what we're describing, Mati velo mati, and the world of Akudim, you have to remember, is the first expression after the Tzimtzum. Right? So let's connect it back quickly in our remaining minute. Let's connect it back to the story of the Kabbalistic creation story, right? Which I think I mentioned last week as well. Right? In the beginning, there's God and His light. God decides He wishes to create. The light is moved to the side. there's an empty space left over. Into the empty space, God shines a single ray of the original light, and that's what creates all worlds, spiritual and physical. So we are actually describing the beginning of the kav, the beginning of the emanation of the single ray of light, after all the light is removed. So really there's two things, and obviously these two things that exist now are very abstract and very conceptual, right? Don't think of them as two separate things, right? None of this is two separate things. It's all the expression of God interacting with itself, or self-interacting according to God's will, right? Should just make clear. But you have two things. You have the light, right? This is this dualism. You have the light of the kav, of the ray, of the original expression of God's light, and you have what's called the reshimu, which is what's left over from the act of the tzimtzum, from the removal of his light, which Spencer would say is doubt. There's two things. There's an expression of God. God is here. That's kav, that's the light. The reshimu is the tzimtzum. There's nothing left of God here. God is removed from here. God is not present, right? These two things become the source for light and vessel. In all the worlds that follow after, you have the eris, the light, and the kalim, the vessels that are left over. And these are created from kav and reshimu, from the ray and the that's left over from the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum leaves over a nature, an impression, yeah. That impression and the kav interact as light and vessel, right? So we are describing that process with different language, right? That's basically what this footnote is describing. As the light extends, mati, the kav is present. Mati is God desires for light and vessel to be together. So the light extends, the light of the ray, the light of the kav, and it reaches the reshimu, which is the source from which the vessels come into existence, right? That's mati. God has the desire, the God himself turns towards, or is inclined toward the creation of the world. What does that mean? It means that kav and reshimu meet. Kav and reshimu touch. The light and the tzimtzum, the void, the lack, the remnant, the reshimu meet.
Reshimu is also light.
Everything is light. Everything is created. Everything that's
light and vessel.
That's what I told you. It's not two different things. It's both expressions of God interacting with each other, interacting with itself, self-interacting. It's not two different things.